Hello everyone, it's Claire Lehman here and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Quillette. Thanks so much for tuning in to our third instalment of Free Thought Live. This one is brought to you by Quillette in collaboration with Think Inc. and supported by the Judith Nelson Institute, which we are very grateful for. I know you will enjoy today's event with Glenn Loury, who needs no introduction. Glenn will be speaking to Josh Szeps, the host of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast. Over to you now, Josh.
I hope you're all doing okay. We are in Sydney at the moment, so we want to give a nod to the traditional owners of the land that we're on, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to Indigenous folks who are young and old and all your ancestors. G'day, it's great to all be here together. I am hugely proud of Claire Lehman at Quillette, the world's leading free thought magazine, and also to Susie Jamil at Think Inc., which is the leading intellectual touring company in Australia, for collaborating on this. It's a fascinating series of conversations with the world's most interesting minds. Today's event is also backed by the Judith Neilson Institute, as you just heard, so a big thanks to them for supporting us. I am Josh Szeps. Like everyone on planet Earth, I have a podcast, as you just heard from Claire. It's called Uncomfortable Conversations. Two of our first guests were Claire Lehman herself and also Sam Harris, so if you do like smart, funny, provocative interviews, then whip out your phone right now and look up Uncomfortable Conversations with Josh Szeps. Here's how today is going to work, though. I will chat with Glenn for about an hour, and for those of you who've bought tickets to a subsequent event, to a hangout, or to the private salon with Glenn afterwards, you will have received a Zoom link. So in an hour, when the conversation ends, click that link. It'll start about 10 minutes later. Glenn Loury is one of America's leading academics and public intellectuals. He has a PhD in economics from MIT. He was the first black tenured professor of economics in the history of Harvard University, and he's published hundreds of essays and books and reviews. He was, for many years, a contributing editor at the New Republic, and now he's the Merton P. Stoltz Professor of Social Sciences and Economics at Brown University. He discusses culture and race on The Glenn Show on Blogging Heads TV. You can find him at patreon.com/Glenn Show. Please welcome Professor Glenn Loury. G'day, Glenn. Let's just start by asking, how are you?
I could be better, I suppose. It's a personal issue. We're moving house. Things are very discombobulated.
You picked just the right year to move. This is perfectly convenient. What could possibly go wrong?
Yes, and just about everything has gone wrong. But I'm not complaining. I'm good.
Well, it was 4 years. Imagine, cast your mind back to 4 years ago, since we're going to be talking about the election a lot. 4 years ago today, we were less than 2 weeks since Hillary Clinton lost the election. It was 8 days after Saturday Night Live opened their show with Hillary Clinton, played by Kate McKinnon, singing Hallelujah. I remember it. I was in New York. A lot of the city was in shock. A lot of the country was in shock. A lot of the world was in shock. Were you?
Yeah, I was in shock. I was very much surprised by it. I may not have been as dismayed as some of my colleagues and friends. I didn't think the sky was falling with the election of Donald Trump, but it was certainly unexpected.
Why did you differ from the opinion of most of your colleagues?
Well, I thought, and the way I put it is that America is changing. Something important is happening in the country. There's a populist rising or insurgency of a certain kind. The establishment, the elites have been repudiated. How could this guy, a carnival barker, I believe that's how President Obama once referred to candidate Trump, have possibly won this election against the old school Democratic kingmaker of the Clintons? How could that possibly have been? So I was quite surprised by it, but I didn't think that it was necessarily the end of the world. I thought, we're entering an interesting, a curious and interesting time now. Let's see what's going to happen.
And to what extent did you attribute that rise in populism to economics versus the cultural or racial explanations?
Old school. I attributed, and I'm not an expert on elections and all of that public opinion.
No, but
I
you're an expert
attributed
on
it,
economics.
yeah, and I attributed it to the appeal of Trump, "Make America Great Again." We're going to control who comes into the country. We're going to jettison these bad deals that are hollowing out the most vulnerable parts of our economy. We're going to get manufacturing back again. I mean, he won Ohio, he won Michigan, he won Wisconsin, close elections. He won Pennsylvania, a close election. I mean, it was very clear what happened. What happened was the strength of the Democrats in the Midwest got flipped, and I did attribute that mainly to economics. I think the cultural partisanship emerged more clearly in my mind as Trump's administration went forward on gun regulation, on religious issues, on racial issues, which I pay a lot of attention to. But at the time of the election, my sense was it was mainly a working class populist rejection of their unions were not as strongly pro democratic, at least their membership, the leadership probably to a person was, but the membership strayed. And I took that to be mainly an economic phenomenon.
And that working class economic backlash against the elites, against the sense that the whole deal had been stitched up for decades and was antagonistic towards the working guy, has now been somewhat repudiated in terms of the latest election results. You mentioned all of those Midwestern and Rust Belt states, Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. Minnesota, those have gone to Joe Biden now. Does that mean, and yet Donald Trump did do a lot of the stuff on international trade that he said he was going to do. He did renegotiate NAFTA, and he has taken a much more harsh line towards China. Does that mean that they weren't buying it?
I don't know. I don't think so necessarily. I mean, these elections in those states that Trump carried narrowly were also relatively close in favor of Biden this time around. Pennsylvania, there may be a recount there. Wisconsin was relatively close. So, one way of looking at it is it was pretty much a 50-50 situation in 2016 in some of those states. And it was pretty much a 50-50 situation in 2020. They just flipped differently on those two occasions.
I must say, it does strike me as amazing. It does strike a lot of people outside of the United States as amazing how close these elections are. Like how predictable it is. Like if someone gets less than 48.5% of the vote, or someone gets more than 52, it's a slam dunk. People are like, oh my goodness, this was a wash. Do you have an explanation for why things are always bouncing around in the 49.5 to 51.5% zone?
I think we're closely divided politically in the country. Trump got, I think, 73 million
Yeah.
plus votes, more than 10 million more votes than he received in 2016. He got more votes than Hillary Clinton got in 2016. A lot of people are supporting him. So it's a closely divided country, and therefore closely fought elections, at least in the swing states we've been talking about.
Let's talk about those 73 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump, because I think many of your criticisms of contemporary American culture and academic thinking may sort of feed into some of the grievances that were motivating such voters. I still want to sort of stick on 2016 as being a point of comparison. And during that election, you'll remember the debate with Hillary Clinton, where Donald Trump was asked about some sexist comments that he'd made in the past, and his answer was the biggest problem in America right now is political correctness, and he got this huge roar of support from the crowd. Was he right then, and is he still right?
I wouldn't call it the biggest problem. I certainly wouldn't call it the biggest problem, but I think it is real. Political correctness is a real phenomenon, and I think there are many people who are tired of being lectured, tired of being told that they're racist because they side with the cops, tired of being asked to apologize for America's missteps in decades and generations past. Tired of being told that whatever the latter day insight or sensibility is about gender or identity, that they have to subscribe to it or else they're Neanderthals. Tired of being condescended to, the kind of sanctimony of the elite opinion foisted on them. So I expect there's something to that. I mean, I can say that because I sometimes feel tired of being told what to think myself, and I'm an Ivy League academic professor, highly educated, and so forth. I can imagine what the guy with dirt under his fingernails who's getting a beer at the bar after a 12-hour shift is thinking when he's told that the pronoun issue of gender identity or whatever, and he's probably thinking that's a bunch of bunk, and you're going to call me a bigot because I don't sign on to your latter day cultural conviction. I think a lot of the people who are pro-life, who are religious people, felt the culture, the political, the center of opinion in the elite newsrooms and the media and whatnot were pushing against them, didn't really respect their way of life and their values. So I think political correctness is a problem. I think people hear the horror stories of so-and-so not being able to speak at a university, or the latest edict issued by some potentate about some sensitive Title IX questions of sexual assault and harassment in universities, in the sense that due process not being respected for people accused, things of this kind.
And do you think that then that sort of narrative, that sort of talk about social justice and equity, the kind of censoriousness that you see from college students in deplatforming speakers, the kind of groupthink that you see at some left-wing media organizations, the sort of the Twitterati really running the show on the left, has been bad for the Democratic Party and bad for that they would have done better in the last election had that not existed?
I wonder if you could conceive of the Democratic Party without that existing. I wonder if it's a feasible move to imagine the Democratic Party simply stripping that away. It seems to a certain extent that some of the constituencies of the Democratic Party hew very closely to these ways of thinking, and Democrats wouldn't be Democrats if they didn't think that way. But having said that, yeah, I expect, and I think I'm not alone in saying so, that for example, there's a debate now going on in saying that some of this political correctness phenomenon hurt the Democrats. There's a debate going on right now among Democrats as they look at the fact that Trump almost survived here, that they didn't clearly take control of the Senate, and probably will not take control of the Senate. As you know, depends on the outcome of two Senate races that will be decided in January, that they lost 10, 12 seats in the House. I'm not sure the exact count, but a considerable setback in the House of Representatives. And that down ballot in the state legislature races in the various states around the country, the Democrats didn't gain ground as had been expected. Some people are saying one of the principal reasons for that is that the Democrats were saddled with opinions about issues that are not widely shared in the populace, but that are essential to key elements of their constituency. So the defund the police slogan that comes out of Black Lives Matter, a somewhat radical approach to the question of police reform, I think was quite unpopular in many places in the country. And some speculate that the Democrats embraced, to the extent that they did embrace it, they kind of half embraced it. They embraced it and then, well, no, we're not really for defunding the police. We're just for sending a social worker along with every police officer whenever he or she has to respond to a call. We're for reallocating funds so as not to put so much stress on the punitive part of policing and to give more social supports to communities where crime issues may be a problem. They said that we're not really for defunding the police, but in fact, the slogan, I think, didn't play well in many congressional districts, and it probably hurt some of their candidates.
And just to clarify, Glenn, on the question of can we imagine a Democratic Party without that, for want of a better word, woke element in it, I think I'm just pointing to this constant tension that exists in a lot of political parties, but certainly in all left wing parties, between the bread and butter, working, unionized, high wage, potentially often anti-immigrant sentiment of the left versus the inner city cosmopolitan, elite kind of woke version, and there's always a tension between those things. So I can imagine a Democratic Party that is the former. I mean, it's sort of the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton in a way, or even pre-Bill Clinton, and the woke phenomenon is a more recent one. I don't know whether you're giving up on the former version of the left altogether and see it as a strand that has no future.
Well, oh no, I wouldn't say that. I think it would be worth fighting for, but I think there's a real fight now for that part of the polity, and that Trump has led the Republicans in making real inroads there. I doubt that we're going to see that completely reverse. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen, but his talk about bringing jobs back and so on, his in effect rejection of the conventional Republican symbiosis with the elites, the financial elites, and so forth, and his kind of rhetoric of populism, put America first, and all of that. I think it has resonated, and perhaps there's an opening. Trumpism without Trump, I guess, might be the way of putting it.
Yeah, well, I was just a friend of mine was just asking me here in Australia who I think the next presidents are going to be, and I said, well, I think the next president will be President Pence, because I think Trump will resign in January before he gets booted out. So we'll get Pence for 3 weeks, then we'll get Biden, then we'll get Kamala, then we'll get Tucker Carlson, then we'll get AOC, and it'll just keep going around in these loops, more and more.
Why do you think Trump will resign? I don't get that. Why would he?
I'm being partially facetious, but I think once the knock comes at the door, I could imagine a scenario in which he has a sensibility of, you know what, this whole game is rigged, you can't fire me, I quit, I do things on my terms, this is ridiculous, and he just upends the table and turns over and storms out. But it's just a hypothesis. Okay. It's just worth noting, Glenn, I mean, when we're talking about this sort of battle for the soul of the Democratic Party and of the broader left, they did pick Biden. It's not like I heard Ta-Nehisi Coates talking the other day and saying, I don't think that conventional sort of blue dog Democrats should be allowed to tell activists the way that they can speak. If I want to talk about defunding the police, I'm terribly sorry that might hurt you in your Midwestern swing district, Mr. Democratic aspirational congressperson. But that is not actually my issue. You always need to have activists who are pushing the conversation in provocative ways, and the chips will fall where they may politically. What do you make of that?
I think that's interesting. I think that's going to keep Nancy Pelosi up late at night. I mean, I think that's predictable coming from Ta-Nehisi Coates. I mean, the kind of supercilious self-righteousness of that pose. Never mind the team. Never mind the fact that you need 50% plus one of whatever the body that's making the decision is in a democracy in order to get what you want. Never mind that. Never mind that not every congressional district looks like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's congressional district, that some people in Western Pennsylvania actually have to fight tooth and nail as Democrats to get themselves elected. Never mind all of that. We get to say whatever we want to say and don't tell us how to talk. Suppose the right wing of the Republican Party were to take that pose and say, we get to wave our banners and we get to hold our rallies and we get to shout our epithets and we get to act like the racists that we actually are, and never mind that. I mean, clearly we would see the problem with that.
Well, so some would say they do. I mean, some would say that the right doesn't do a very good job of clamping down on racists going out and rallying.
Yeah, I suppose some would say that.
All right, I'll take that as a comment. Let's talk about this.
You got me there, Josh. You got me there.
Let's talk about this past summer. You wrote a piece in Quillette in June about the riots and about the civil unrest in the wake of George Floyd's killing. And I think it's impossible to analyze the impact and the causes of the 2020 election without understanding what was taking place over the summer. What was your position?
I think the piece was called something like "Denounce the Violence Now" or "Without Equivocation." And I was urging my fellow Americans, I won't classify myself beyond that, to not hold back in asserting the with clarity and with force, with conviction, the unacceptability of violence and the destruction of property and the attacks on police officers and the looting and arson that were breaking out around the edges of mostly peaceful demonstrations. That's the formula, mostly peaceful. And indeed, they were mostly peaceful, but the fact is that they were not entirely peaceful. And often the news, the most newsworthy fact of what was happening was that a police station had been seized and was being set on fire, that a shopping center had been attacked by mobs of people who broke through windows and carried out goods, that property was being destroyed, and that assaults were being carried out against people in these situations. And I thought that needed to be denounced with clarity for the sake of both the those who wanted to see Donald Trump unseated. Well, he has been unseated, narrowly so. But I thought it was an albatross around the neck of Democratic candidates to have to go into an election with this kind of disorder ongoing, but also for the sake of the country as a whole. I thought that the right moral principle was to, in the face of the unrest, was to denounce the violence, encourage people to express their opinions peacefully, but to denounce without the hesitation or equivocation the violence that was breaking out. So I said so.
Is there a problem with the way that the media covers such things, in the sense that if you had 98 or 99% of people who are hitting the streets being peaceful, but you have 1 or 2% of people who capitalize on the riots just to cause a shitstorm, pardon the French, that those people are the ones who get all of the attention? And is there any way to avoid that?
Well, if they were getting all of the attention, that would be a problem. If you turned on Fox News, as I did occasionally do just to see what they were saying, I would turn on Sean Hannity or Tucker Carlson, and I'd get a loop of video of incidents of violence. You'd think the only thing that was happening was the violence because they wanted to highlight it. That was a misreporting of what was going on. It was not a balanced reporting of what was going on. But I think on the other side, there was also a tendency to suppress a critical reporting on these demonstrations, to put a prettier face on them, perhaps than was warranted, to downplay some of the ugliness that one could find. So I think there's enough blame in terms of biased or distorted reporting about these incidents to go around. It's part of what I see as a problem in our time with our political culture, that the very narration and reportage and the putting out of facts gets conditioned by political sensibility, and a reader doesn't know what to believe.
Is that getting worse?
I don't know. Maybe it will not be as bad in a post-Trump era. I don't know. Um, my sense is it's a lot worse now than it was 10 years ago, and worse by far than it was 25 years ago.
Well, I mean, I've even noticed it getting worse in the past 4 years, in the sense that that there are mainstream publications now where you can clearly see the ideological bent in terms of their wanting to be part of a larger mission, I suppose, to vanquish Trumpism and and to always put the most negative possible spin on it, which means that it's not that they're publishing lies or misleading information. I'm not making a false equivalence between the New York Times and Breitbart here, but I can even see as a journalist that there's an ideological pool that is intended to pull you along, and if you diverge from it, there are consequences.
Well, and we're hearing this from people. The Barry Weiss case at the New York Times, or Glenn Greenwald or Andrew Sullivan. There are a number of these cases of very fine journalists who have been squeezed by the sense to which what they want to say doesn't line up with what their colleagues think is the appropriate posture for journalist. I think that I actually canceled my print subscription to the New York Times. I still have the online access, but I just felt it was becoming a propaganda rag. I keep reading stories and thinking, my God, I mean, you're not actually giving me a balanced account of what's happening here. You're trying to tell me what to think. I felt manhandled, so to speak, by some of these organs as they become propaganda organs to a certain degree. So
I don't mean to rain on your defiance towards the New York Times, but if you're still a subscriber to the digital edition, you know they're still counting you as a subscriber in terms of the way that they promote themselves to advertisers. So you're still part of the problem, Mr. Glenn Loury. You're still part of the New
oh
York
well,
Times.
yeah. Well, I have to have access because I'm a public intellectual and I stuff is coming up and I need to be able to get at the article and this behind a firewall. So
You're allowed. I forgive you. I forgive you. I mean, of course, I'll just touch on cancel culture here while we're on the subject, and then we can get on to bigger things. But the counter
yeah.
argument, which I've heard put by the Ezra Kleins of the world, is that yeah, today's environment might be hostile to a person like Barry Weiss or Andrew Sullivan, but the reality is that throughout all of human history, if you were a trans woman of color and you were in an editorial meeting, if you were even able to get a job that got you a seat at the editorial meeting in the first place, and you pitched something, there would be a lot of raised eyebrows. You know, something that was personal to your lived experience, as we're supposed to call it now. There'd be a lot of raised eyebrows, and it'd probably get shot down, and you'd probably find yourself excluded and driven out. So now the tables have turned, and it's the Andrew Sullivans who are getting driven out. But this is the first time in history that it's been going that way. Do you give any credence to that?
What kind of argument is that? I mean, how do two wrongs make a right? I mean,
This is what I was
if not
wondering, but I just
taking,
wanted to get your take.
okay, well, that's my take.
Yeah, okay. You tweeted yesterday that the US race debate is about to change. You said, unencumbered by quote unquote orange man bad, the discourse is freer now. What are you anticipating?
Well, so um, African Americans, we talk about the race debate, so I'm talking about blacks in the cities, with high crime rates and high poverty rates and schools that are not working and dilapidated housing and disorder and so on, uh, are, I think, entitled to better governance in those metropolitan areas than they've been receiving. Um, these are one party states or cities. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of malfeasance and incompetency. People are long serving incumbents who haven't really delivered for their people. I just assert that people will argue the point. But let me stipulate that there are some problems in Baltimore, in St. Louis, in Chicago, in Detroit, in Oakland, California, and whatnot, that are the legitimate basis for political criticism of the governing classes of those cities. Now, with Donald Trump trumpeting from the podium at a press conference, attacking the elected officials serving in the Congress or serving at the local level in these places, um, calling them in effect, failed states, and you know, uh, telling African Americans, "What do you have to lose? You might as well try," whatever. With Donald Trump looming in the background, any criticism that affirms something that Donald Trump had said becomes less effective and indeed discrediting to the person who offers the criticism in virtue of the fact that you're saying something that Donald Trump said. Now, let me just declare, I don't think Donald Trump was wrong about everything. But it was impossible to agree with him, given that he was Orange Man bad, given that he was a racist, quote unquote, in the imaginations of so many people, given that he was the personification of white supremacy in the imaginations of so many people. So if, as a person, in my case, an African American, engaged in debate about the race issue here in the country, I wanted to step away from conventional wisdom and enter into some of these dirty laundry, areas of saying, why can't why can't the schools work better at delivering effective education to people in our society who need it most? I would be loath to say it full-throatedly if I thought I was going to wake up to a tweet from the president of the United States the next day saying, you see, even Ivy League professors agree with me. But with him out of the way, perhaps there's more space for that kind of conversation to take place. Perhaps we can get past this apocalyptic kind of posture. Oh my God, the sky is falling. The world is coming to an end. A racist is in the White House. Fascism looms on the horizon. And we can actually talk about what can be done to more effectively educate the tens upon tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of African American and other youngsters who depend on public schools in struggling cities, and who are, if you look at the test scores and so are not being effectively educated. What can we do? Maybe that conversation can take place. Maybe we can talk about crime and violence, not just violence perpetrated by police officers. I'm happy to talk about that. By all means, let's hold those police officers accountable. But the greater, far greater scale of violence being perpetrated on African Americans in the communities where they live by criminals, by thugs, by violent criminals. Maybe we can actually talk more about that if we're not echoing Orange Man bad. That's what I had in mind.
I like that. I mean, I think it's also a good repudiation of, I was talking to a lot of people in this sort of what I would call the broadly the radical center, the intellectual dark web type people who are not supporters of Trump, but who are also, not crazy about regressive leftist woke politics. And some of them I have had disagreements with leading up to the election because they seemed to believe that voting for Trump would at least be a bulwark against the insanity of the far left. And my position was always, you don't understand that Trump is playing the left just as much as he's playing his base. I mean, one of the ingenious aspects of his nihilism, in my opinion, is not just that he's able to activate the Republican base, but that he's so good at activating the left-wing base in precisely the wrong ways for them to appeal to the kinds of voters they need to appeal to win elections, and in precisely the right ways to cause a whole lot of headache for everybody. So I take your point there that it's even a bigger point perhaps than the one you just made, which is not only does his absence give people who share his critiques space to talk, but his absence gives people who don't share his critiques space to talk in a way that's more reasoned and rational than they have been. So let's talk about some of those things. I mean, you just mentioned crime and violence. What would be agenda number one if Glenn Loury was emperor of the universe now?
I would invest more in education, and I would open up the provision of educational services to more competition with charter schools and things like that. I would take seriously the problem of the maintenance of order in areas where there are a lot of guns and there's a lot of violence, and put that really near the top of my agenda. I don't have a magic bullet. I mean, I don't know what the answer to the question of urban violence is, but I just know that the loss, the pathos, the agony, the tragic pain that's being endured by people, children being gunned down and so on. It's just horrible. I would want to make that a major focus. There are a lot of small bore kind of policy things that one can talk about, but that's there's healthcare, of course, that's not small bore. We're going to see what will happen with the Democrats now in the White House, but you need the legislature to get anything done, and it's going to be a problem getting anything done.
In your academic economic research, you're an expert on income disparities. How much of a role does inequality play in all of this?
Oh, I think it plays a major role. Not just racial inequality, by the way. I think one reason for the populist turn in American political culture is stagnation and wages and economic opportunity for a bulk of the population, and a pulling away of the elites. So I think it's a big deal.
What do we do
I
about
mean,
that?
it's obvious that the energy in the Democratic Party on the left is substantially fueled, it seems to me, by a reaction against the rising inequality of wealth and of income, and the separation of economic opportunity between the coastal elite, highly educated, and people who are in the factories and mines and uh, fracking industry and things like that in the center of the country.
And yet, as you mentioned earlier, that may be the ideas that are motivating the Democratic Party, but the people who you're talking about there are overwhelmingly Trump's base.
They are, or at least in many of those places, they are. That's true.
Hmm.
I noticed that minimum wage legislation, or I should say, ballot initiatives that came before plebiscites that came before the electorate in a number of the states did relatively well. I think that is an indication of people's discontent about inequality.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure
Um,
out whether or not there's a transpartisan solution to this, or at least a transpartisan framing for the conversation, so that the conversation about inequality on the left can't get caricatured by the right as being hatred of billionaires, and the conversation about inequality on the right can't get caricatured by the left as not caring about poor people and being hoity-toity, rich Wall Street fat cats. I don't know. Can you see a common ground?
no, I don't see a common ground. I mean,
You're killing me,
I
Glenn.
don't see it. I'm
I'm
sorry,
coming here for
man.
good news. You really get me down today. So let's look at the next 4 years then. So we've got a Biden administration. What do you foresee?
Well, I assume that the first 100 days or 150 days will be trying to undo a lot of what they can undo without the U.S. Congress of what Trump had done. This will be the deregulation impetus of Trump will get undone, because the president can do much of that by administrative fiat. Um, there'll be a lot of I gather we'll be going back into the Paris Accord on climate. I gather we'll be trying to resurrect the Iran deal. I gather that our relations with our allies in NATO will have certainly a different tone, less adversarial, in an effort to restore America. I find it interesting. Make America great again. Put America first. These were Trump's, slogans. America first. And I never heard anybody argue against that proposition. Although I think many people graded at it. America should be a leader of the world in confronting the great problems of peace and prosperity and climate. And as a leader, we shouldn't be putting our interests nakedly first. We should be trying to, by example, show how cooperative and humanitarian enhancing, efforts on a global scale can be enacted. But I never heard anybody say, "Oh no, America should be first." No, no, no. Don't
America
put America
third. How about America third?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's not a very popular slogan. But
Right after Denmark.
I gather there will be a less nakedly self-interested, from a national point of view, rhetoric, and we're going to rejoin the World Health Organization, for example, and whatnot. So I expect there'll be a change in that kind of rhetoric. I don't know how many judges. These are lifetime appointments to the federal courts. Trump appointed hundreds of judges, three members of the United States Supreme Court. His impact on the federal judiciary in just these 4 short years has been monumental. That's not something that can be undone by a Democratic president, because those are lifetime appointments. And moreover, anything that Biden should try to do by way of judicial appointments will have to get through the Senate, which is likely to remain in Republican hands, and so on. So
Yeah, a lot is going to come down to the much famed friendship between Mitch McConnell and Joe Biden as to whether or not anything happens in the next 4 years, isn't it? It's going to test test that friendship. I would imagine. But what you're talking about there in terms of America First is really interesting, and it gets to something where I really want to get your thoughts on, which is the role of America in the world and how we should think about the legacy of America, because fundamental to all of this, underpinning 2016, 2020, the division in media between social media and these legacy media outlets who all have a certain agenda to push, underpinning the grievances of the left and the grievances of working people is a sort of a differing sensibility about what America means and what kind of future we want for America. And I noticed that you were on Megyn Kelly's podcast recently with Coleman Hughes, and she excerpted a piece that sort of went viral where you were pushing back against the 1619 Project at the New York Times and this idea that America is fundamentally instantiated as a genocidal calamity. And I want you to just sort of tell us what you said there and put it in a context that might be larger and help us think about the big forces that are shaping the states at the moment.
Well, that's tall order, Josh. Let me see what I can
You've
do.
got 4 minutes. No, you've got as much time as you want.
Well, no. So I was asked about the 1619 project, which I've been critical of. This is.
And do you want to just explain to? Yeah, sorry. Yeah, explain to people.
Yeah, I was just going to explain that the New York Times Sunday magazine devoted one of its issues to an exploration of the founding of America and an advocacy of the position that the year 1619, taken as the inauguration of slavery in the United States, because it was the year, and that's very early. 1619 is before the Mayflower lands in Massachusetts. 1619, we're in Virginia, and some African captive slaves are put ashore and are acquired, purchased by colonialists. It's the first instance of slavery in the United States. So 1619, it's argued in the project, should be the center of our thinking about the American story. That's when the country starts, and the narrative about America needs to much more assiduously attend to the role of enslavement, of racial domination, of white supremacy in the founding and the making of the country. 1619, not 1776, is the year when the American story really gets founded. The struggle of African Americans for human dignity and for equal citizenship, an organizing principle around which you can understand the history of the country. And I objected with others to that for a number of grounds. I don't want to necessarily right here recap.
People can always listen to Megan's podcast. You don't have to. I'm not asking
Indeed,
you
they can.
To dance.
They can. But I was saying what's going on here is a struggle over the narrative that one is going to tell concretely, directly to one's children in the schools. How do we teach the story of the country? And without wanting to fall into some kind of jingoistic propaganda, America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, America, the beacon of hope to all of mankind, America, a city on a hill, without attending to the crimes in American history and to the tragedy of what was chattel slavery over centuries, to what happened to the indigenous people of the North American continent as a consequence of its conquest and domination by what became the American nation state. Without forgetting those things, nevertheless, to tell a more balanced account, an account that credited the greatness of the American project, an account that recognized the extraordinary significance in world history of the founding of the country. I mean, the French Revolution plays out in parallel to the American Revolution at the end of the 18th century. And the American Revolution lays down a template, a structure of government that instantiates Enlightenment era ideals that influence the founding generation of the country in institutions that actually survive to the present day and that constitute an example to aspiring peoples all over the world and have done so for many generations. A country that actually faced up to the imperative of destroying slavery fitfully and with great cost in a great civil war. But nevertheless, the slaves were freed and made citizens of the Republic, and in the fullness of time came to be equal citizens of the Republic. This is a world historic accomplishment, I wanted to say. America is the place where the world turns in its desperation facing fascism. Of course, my friends in Russia have been emailing me, telling me, you didn't win the Second World War all by yourself. You didn't defeat Nazism all by yourself. I take the point. But the United States of America did defeat fascism in the Pacific and did, with the cooperation of allies, defeat fascism in Europe, did stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet Union. Which of those forces, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or the United States of America, would you would one with thought rather have seen prevail in the contest which was the Cold War? It's a good and a great country. It's been a land of receiving wave after wave of immigrants from every corner of the globe. Tens of millions of new Americans have come into our polity in the last half century from mostly non-European points of origin and have been assimilated into the body politic, have prospered, have been accepted. African Americans are the wealthiest and most powerful large population of African descent on the planet. The gross national product of Nigeria, with its 200 million people, is less than $1 trillion a year. The United States GNP is $20 trillion a year, and African Americans have got, well, maybe not quite 10% of that, and we're 35 or 40 million strong. We're 5 to 10 times richer than the average Nigerian. I give that just as one example. So there's a lot to celebrate here, and it's a good and a great country. It's not a flawless country. It's not perfect, but it is perfectible, and it has shown itself to be interested in pursuing that project of perfectibility. And that is a different narrative in approaching the question of telling the story. I wouldn't want to tell the story of America without attention to slavery, but I wouldn't want to make the story of America be driven by my antipathy to slavery and my sense that those who were prepared to practice it are, therefore beneath contempt, and the political project that they initiated should be viewed with fundamental suspicion. No, in fact, that political project brought about the world that we live in. And warts and all, it's a story worth affirming. There's nothing wrong with a patriotic affirmation of the accomplishments of the American project, of the virtue of the American project, even as one remains cognizant of its flaws and of the need to acknowledge them.
Glenn, on the question of who really won the Second World War, your Russian friends might write to you saying that they played some part in vanquishing the Nazis, but I think we all know deep down that Australia was the indispensable nation to win the Second World War. I'll just take it. You're welcome. You're welcome, Glenn.
Sorry, I'm sorry, but I do appreciate your sacrifice.
Thank you. What was interesting, though, was that so Megyn Kelly tweeted out a quote of some of what you were just articulating, and what's extraordinary is to read the replies. I mean, I know one should never read Twitter replies or a comment thread, but just to a random sample here. Oh, what a convenient narrative of history, one person writes. That's all this is, after all, a narrative that highlights the triumphs of the oppressed and downplays the innumerable horrors committed by the oppressors. Another person writes of you, you insist on justifying what's wrong and ugly. You don't listen to the people that you hurt, demonized, stepped on, treated less than, or stole from. It's all about you. That's why we needed the 1619 Project. You're still not listening. Are you still not listening, Glenn?
I'm listening, but I don't understand why uh, a, a affirmation of the virtues and the signal accomplishments of the American project precludes what it is that those critics would have me do, which is to acknowledge and teach to my children uh, the things that have been problematic and that have been wrong. What would they have me do about these historical wrongs? I mean, no, they should not be forgotten. But must we go through the next 100 years in various acts of abnegation and self-flagellation and apology? Uh,
I was going to say, I think
with
what they want you to do is get a bunch of reeds and slap yourself across the back in a public display of self-flagellation every time you appear in public. Um, I wonder whether or not you think that. Let's just talk about. I want to sort of look down the track, and I totally take what you were just saying because I think the reason why I was trying to link this conversation about what is the moral character of the United States of America to the specifics of the election and all of the culture war stuff that we're talking about at the moment is because I think part of Trump's appeal and part of the "Make America Great" slogan is the sense that America has been great and can be great, and that vision is opposed to a vision on the left that is often mealy-mouthed and petty and sanctimonious and somewhat ugly or judgy. And if you've got a large body of Americans who are saying we are fundamentally decent people and this is a fundamentally decent country, and I don't hear enough of
right.
that from the left, then who are they going to vote for apart from the guy who says that it's great and it can be even greater? But I want to wrap up by thinking about how race and the culture wars feed into all of this in the future. What should we be doing? How should we be talking? And will there be a day when race doesn't matter in the United States?
I hope so, but I don't see it. It's going to not happen in my lifetime. A day when race doesn't matter. Um, what I think we should be doing is acknowledging the need to address the deficits within the African American population that are a consequence of this long history of unequal treatment. Deficits reflected, for example, in the intellectual development of the youngsters, which is inadequate, or in the overrepresentation amongst criminal offenders, or whatever. And make that the focus of our discourse. That's a big, complicated set of issues. But development, acknowledging the inadequacy of the development of African American capacities to function and to perform. This, on the average, for a large population, not with respect to every individual, but addressing those deficits. So I've been saying in some of the things I've been writing lately that, and then again, this is about narratives. We were talking just a moment ago about the narrative of the American project. How do you tell the story of the country? And I want to talk about the narrative that we use to account for the racial disparities and inequalities that we see in the country right now. And one of those kinds of narrations is puts the emphasis on bias, on unfair treatment, on discrimination, on racism. The idea is that the gap that we might see, whether it's in the educational or in the workplace or the wealth holdings or whatever, is a function of bias, of unfair treatment, and that the remedy is to address ourselves to white society to insist that they reform, that they repent, that they acknowledge and reverse their biased and racially unfair engagement with African Americans. That's one narrative, the bias. But I want to juxtapose to that the idea of development. Uh, uh, Disparity for African American life, or failure to credit the value of African American contribution. Rather, they are a result of the fact that history has cast a long shadow, and a history of slavery, and then of exclusion and marginalization, and then of segregation and discrimination, has had its consequences, and one needs to redress those consequences by enhancing the capacities of African Americans to perform. So that's the broad umbrella that I would bring to the question that you posed about how I would like to see conversations about race and racial inequality shape up going forward. But fundamentally, I would situate that kind of a discourse within a commitment to enhance the capacities for functioning for all Americans, not just for African Americans. I wouldn't make the race question the primary question of politics or of social policy. But to the extent that I'm talking about the race question, I would want to focus much more on redressing the underdevelopment of African American populations within the American political economy than on emphasizing, castigating, and criticizing the purported racial bias and discrimination. Because I think a lot of the disparities that we are confronted with today are not in any straightforward way the result of biased behavior by the power structure, but rather are a reflection of the failures of too many African American youngsters to realize their full human potential.
One of the impediments, of course, about having that conversation is that that's a conversation that the moment a white person steps into is regarded as being something of an apologist for white supremacy. You can't sort of say, well, I mean, white. What about black on black crime, or what about the dysfunction of impoverished black families, without sounding like you're trying to change the
Why
subject
not?
from racism?
Well, you are changing the subject from racism, and why not? Well, should a white person? I think so. I don't encourage their convictions. And when confronting an African American who accuses him of racism, say no. I think when 70% of African American youngsters are born to a woman who's not married, meaning those kids are raised in a household where the father is not routinely present, that's a very profound sociological fact that has far-reaching implications for the development of the human potential of the kids who are in that situation. It's not neutral. It's a significant impediment to realizing the possibilities that the society presents to all of its citizens. And we want to help you deal with that problem. We want to so order our institutions so as to affirm what needs to happen in the lives of youngsters, so that by the time they're in the 4th or the 5th grade, they're reading at grade level, so that they are able to mature into stable and well-balanced individuals who are able to function within the society without running afoul of our law and so on, without being predators with respect to their neighbors and so on. Why should a white person shrink from telling the truth if it's what they think about situations? So who cares if you're called a racist? You're not a racist. Tell them I'm not a racist. I'm treating you like an adult. I'm taking you seriously, and I'm telling you what I really think.
Part of the problem, and by the way, to the viewers, we're aware of the slightly dodgy connection we sometimes get to your line, Glenn. But such is the nature of chatting during a pandemic. I mean, the problem, Glenn, is that in parallel to this kind of cultural taboo is running the machinery of the Twitter cancel culture public shaming universe, in which it's all very well for someone to articulate that they're not a racist, but if the mob comes for you, then it can have real world consequences.
Okay. I accept that. I know many people for whom those consequences have been very troublesome.
Do you have a message, I suppose, to people who are watching this who want to be able to articulate themselves in a more rational and unimpeded way about these sensitive issues?
Not really. I mean, I just said what I had to say to them. I said, have the courage of your convictions and take people seriously enough to tell them what you actually think. When you don't tell people what you actually think, you're patronizing them in a way. You're treating them like a child whom you're afraid uh, to provoke into a tantrum.
Mm.
Uh, I worry about this a great deal. That there is a uh, superficial um, pablum of public expression, and then underneath that there is a very very different sensibility that is husbanded and is not said publicly, and maybe it's said only in the most intimate of private space, but that is nevertheless there. I worry that some of these, for example, incidents where an encounter happens between a young black man and a police officer that ends badly. The young black man is killed by the police officer. Maybe he was attacking him. Maybe he had a very extensive a criminal record. Maybe he was on drugs when the encounter took place. Maybe he was a miscreant that hadn't held a decent job in a decade. Maybe he was abusive to his romantic partner or the mother of his children or whatever it might be. Maybe he had robbed a convenience store of a package of cigarillos before he went out and got into a fight with an armed police officer that ended up with him being shot dead in the street. And the superficial narrative is a white supremacy strikes yet again. Racist police officer, thug police officer guns down innocent black man with his hands up, begging not to be shot. But the reality is, well, a belligerent criminal provokes a police officer by placing him in danger of his life to the point that the police officer feels compelled to use deadly force in order to control the situation, leaving this young man laying dead in the street. That's the reality of what actually happened in the minds of many people. And I worry that the superficial conversation covers up the resentment that many people will harbor at A, being told something that they know is not true, and B, then being told to shut up about it, lest they be called racist or labeled as insensitive. And I feel that might be one of the things going on that accounts for the surprising strength of a demagogue like Donald J. Trump in American politics. That there are people who won't tell poll takers. The polls were wildly off yet again. This is twice in a row that the polls have wildly underestimated the strength. Know that they are not supposed to say certain things, but they nevertheless harbor these thoughts. And once it's gone underground, it can't be engaged anymore. You're not really winning an argument when your basic trump card, pardon the pun, is to threaten to cancel people if they dare to speak out. You're not winning that argument. You're just making people go underground with it.
Well, hopefully those underground arguments and those conversations that people are having in private and in the solace of their own brains are being brought out into the open through conversations like this, conversations like the ones that Quillette is committed to and ones that Think Inc. are committed to and that I'm committed to on my podcast, Uncomfortable Conversations. Glenn, it's a pleasure and a delight to talk to you. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Josh. It was really my pleasure.
Thanks for the wonderful conversation, Josh and Glenn, and thanks to you all for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's conversation, head over to Quillette's Patreon page and Glenn's Patreon page and show your support. And I have an exciting announcement for you all. Our next Free Thought Live will be with Helen Pluckrose, co-author of the best-selling 2020 release, Cynical Theories. Watch out for an email that is about to drop into your inbox so you can register for that one. That's all from me. Bye for now.